He was already gone by the time the morning shift arrived. That was what the charge nurse wrote in the handoff notes at 6:43 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. Patient unresponsive. Family unable to be reached. Condition deteriorated overnight. She wrote the date and signed her name, and then she noted something else that would have seemed small to anyone who read it. Nurse Dina Cole had remained at the patient's bedside through her entire 12-hour shift and had not left the room once. The charge nurse wrote it because she thought it was worth recording. Something in her gut said it mattered, even though she could not have said why. She wrote it and filed the note with the rest. She had no way of knowing that note would become the most important document in a room full of lawyers 2 years later. Dina Cole was 31 years old when she sat with Walter Hines through the last night of his life. She had been a registered nurse at Covenant General Hospital for 6 years, working the third-floor cardiac step-down unit, and in those 6 years she had seen a great deal of death. She'd seen it come fast and violent, and she had seen it come slow and deliberate, and she had learned the difference between the two. He was the slow and deliberate kind. His heart had been failing by degrees for a long time, and when he arrived at Covenant General on a Sunday afternoon by ambulance, the paramedics knew it, and the attending physician knew it, and Dina knew it when she received him at her station. What no one knew was who he was. He had a driver's license in his wallet. The name on it and the home address on Clement Street were the only facts it offered. Age 73. He had no emergency contact listed anywhere in the hospital system. He had no phone on his person, no wallet beyond the license, and a folded $20 bill. He did not speak when he arrived, and he did not speak again after that. A social worker tried 3 times Sunday evening and twice Monday morning to locate family through the county system, and came up empty each time. So he lay in room 318 without a single person in the world coming through the door, and Dana started her shift at 7 p.m. Monday and accepted him into her care. She had 4 other patients that night. She always had 4 other patients. The cardiac step-down unit ran at capacity most nights, and Dana moved between rooms with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to portion her attention into exact fractions and keep each fraction whole. She checked vitals and adjusted drip rates and answered call buttons and documented everything with the quiet precision her supervisor had noted on every evaluation she had ever received. She was good at her job. She was good at it in the way that people are good at something they have built piece by piece out of real love, and the love was never hidden. She checked on him at 9 p.m. and found him the same. She checked on him at 10 and at 11, and at 11:30 his monitor showed a downward shift in rhythm that brought her back to the room fast. She adjusted the medication and sat with him for 20 minutes, watching the line on the monitor settle back into something that would hold for a while but would not hold for long. She knew what she was looking at. She had seen it many times. She went back to her other patients. She came back to Walter at 1 a.m. The room was very quiet. The city outside was doing what cities do at 1 in the morning, which is to keep moving in the dark and not ask permission from anyone. The monitor above the bed made its soft, regular sound, and the light from it was green and faint, and the ventilation hummed somewhere in the ceiling, and beyond those sounds there was nothing. Dina stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the man in the bed. He was thin in the way that people become thin when an illness has been working at them for a long time. His hands on the sheet were the hands of a man who had spent his life doing something physical, wide-palmed and weathered even now. His breathing was slow and uneven, with a pause between the exhale and the next inhale that Dina recognized. She had heard that particular rhythm before. She knew what it meant. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. It was the chair the family was supposed to use when there was family. She put her hand over his hand, and she stayed. She did not stay because the hospital told her to. There was no policy that required it. She stayed because she had looked at this man lying alone in a room without a single candle burning for him in the world, and something in her had refused. Not like this. Not alone. She checked her other patients at 2 and at 2:45, moving between rooms with the quiet steps she had learned over years of keeping people undisturbed in the deep middle of the night. Then she came back to room 318. She sat again. The chair was not made for sleeping, and she had no intention of sleeping. She sat with her back straight and her hand near his, and she watched the green line on the monitor and thought about the way the night sounds in a hospital are not quite silence. They are something closer to the sound of work being done quietly, the work of keeping people alive through the hours when the body is most uncertain of itself, when the hold on life is loosest, and the people who walk the hallways at 3 in the morning are walking between lives that are balanced, and their job is to keep them there. She thought about her mother. She thought about a patient she had lost in her second year of nursing whose daughter had held her hand through the last night and had said afterward, with a clarity that Dina had never forgotten, that she had not known she was capable of sitting still for that long, that grief had taught her something about patience she had not known she needed. Dina had been young enough when she heard that to think she understood it. She understood it better now, and not as an abstraction. She understood it in the bone, the way you understand things that have been given a chance to settle. At 3:15, the man in the bed made a small sound that was not quite a word, and not quite a breath, and Dana leaned forward and said quietly, "I'm here. You're not alone." She did not know whether he heard her. She said it anyway because the saying was not for the hearing. It was for the room. It was to put that truth into the air of the room and let it be there. If you have ever made a small decision in a quiet room that cost you nothing and everything at the same time, then you know what she did that night. She did not announce it. She did not ask for acknowledgement. She sat in the family chair in room 318 and she held a dying stranger's hand, and the hours moved past her. And she was still there when he stopped breathing at 4:57 in the morning. She held his hand for a moment after that, too. Then she stood up and she straightened the sheet and she went to do what came next. Dina's life in those years was the kind that gets called simple by people who have not looked closely enough at it to see how much work goes into keeping something together when the seams are always under pressure. She had grown up in the western part of the city, in a neighbourhood that had never been on any best of list, but had always been full of people who kept their yards clean and their word good and their children fed. Her mother, Ruthie, was 63 and lived in the same house where Dana grew up, and she had a bad hip that surgery had helped and time had not. And Dina drove over on Sundays to do the cooking for the week and make sure the medications were filled and the porch light wasn't burned out again. Dina rented an apartment on the 4th floor of a building on Magnolia Street. It was a one-bedroom, and the one bedroom was enough because Dina lived alone. She had been engaged at 27 to a man named Marcus who was kind and funny and had ultimately decided that the life of a nurse's partner, with the unpredictable hours and the emotional weight that came home in Dina's face some nights, was not the life he could sustain. They had ended things without cruelty, which was its own kind of grace, and Dana had not dated seriously since. There was not a bitterness about it. There was something more like a quiet acceptance that her life had the shape it had, and the shape was not wrong, just narrow in certain ways. She made $53,000 a year. Her rent was $1,400 a month. Her mother's prescriptions ran to about $400 a month after insurance, and Dana covered the difference because Ruthie's fixed income did not cover it. She had a car with 112,000 miles on it that she kept as well as a car can be kept on a nurse's budget, which is to say she knew which noises were fine and which noises were not fine, and she chose when to address them with some care. She had a savings account with about $3,000 in it, which she called her floor, meaning the amount below which she would not allow herself to go. $3,000 was her floor, and some months she came close to it, and in those months she did not sleep as well. She did not talk about any of this at work. She showed up for her shifts. She did her job. She was good to her patients in the way that is more than technique, in the way that is character. What happened that night was not unusual for Dana. It was consistent with who she was. She had held hands before and would hold hands again. She did not tell anyone about that night, not because she was hiding it, but because it did not seem like a story she had told. It was just something she had done. You sit with someone. You don't leave them alone. That was the whole of it. 2 weeks after he died, Dina came in for her shift and found a card in her mailbox at the nurse's station. It was a plain white envelope with her name written in handwriting she did not recognize. She opened it and found a card with a small printed message of condolence and a handwritten note. "Thank you for what you did for our father. We will not forget it." It was signed by two names, Ray and Corinne Hines. There was no return address. Dina put the card in her locker. She thought about the card for a few days, feeling the warmth of it and the slight sadness of it, the way you feel when a small good thing shows up late. She wondered about Ray and Corinne Hines, about what kind of estrangement ends with a handwritten thank you to a stranger for being with your father. She thought that the word estrangement contained a whole private story she would never know, and she let herself sit with that for a while, the way she had learned to sit with the things about her patients she would never fully understand. Then she put the card back in her locker and went on. She didn't hear from Ray or Corinne Hines again. Life continued. March became April. April became summer. Dina worked her shifts and drove to her mother's on Sundays and paid her bills in the order they needed to be paid. Her floor dipped to $2,800 one month when the car needed a wheel bearing, and she did not sleep well for about 10 days, and then it came back up to $3,000, and she steadied. In June, she picked up an extra shift every other week to cover the deficit, which meant she was working 56 hours in those 2-week stretches instead of 48. She did it without complaint. She put the extra on the savings and watched the number come back up, and then steadied herself and let the extra shifts go, because she understood that fatigue was a patient safety issue, even when no one was telling you so. She had learned the difference between sustainable and survivable, and she managed her own life the way she managed her patients, with close attention and no pretending. There was a patient that August, a woman named Dorothy who was 67 and recovering from a coronary bypass, and who had no one come to visit her in the entire 9 days of her hospitalization. And Dana spent extra minutes in that room each time she was there, bringing the afternoon paper when there was one, talking about small things when Dorothy wanted to talk, sitting quietly when she didn't. Dorothy went home on a Thursday afternoon in a cab, and Dina watched the cab pull away from the hospital entrance from the second-floor window where she could see the drop-off circle, and she thought about the things a person carries home alone after 9 days in a hospital bed, and then she went back to her station. She did not think of herself as a person who performed uncommon acts of care. If someone had said that to her, she would have deflected it. She thought of herself as someone who paid attention and did what the moment required. The paying attention was not optional in her view of the work. It was the work. The hospital ran a budget review that fall and eliminated 2 per diem positions on the 3rd floor, which meant the nurses who remained carried more. Dana carried more. She did not complain. She reorganized her charting system so she could move faster without cutting corners, and her supervisor noticed and said so, and it did not come with a raise. Have you ever watched someone carry a weight that would buckle most people and watch them carry it as if it was simply what carrying looks like? If so, leave a word in the comments. There is something in hearing from people who recognize this. And hold on, because what happens next is the reason this story exists. She was in the break room eating lunch alone on a Wednesday in February of the following year when her colleague from the desk knocked on the door and said there was someone at the nurse's station asking for her. Not a patient family, her colleague said, a man in a suit. Dina set down her cup and went to the desk. The man was about 50. He was not tall, but he was composed in the manner of someone who had spent decades being precise in rooms where precision mattered. He wore a dark grey suit and carried a leather portfolio, and his name, he said, was Gerald Moss. He was an attorney. He handed her his card and she looked at it for a moment before she looked back up at him. He said, "I represent the estate of Walter E. Hines. I've been trying to locate you for some time." The break room was down the hall. The nurse's station was open and not private, and 2 of Dana's colleagues were at the desk pretending not to listen, which meant they were listening. The attorney seemed to understand this. "Is there somewhere we could speak privately?" he said. They found a family consultation room on the 2nd floor that was not in use. Dana sat across from him with her hands in her lap, and she waited with the particular patience of someone who has spent years keeping their composure while being told things that are hard to hear. He opened his portfolio and said, "You were the attending nurse when he died at this hospital 2 years ago, this past March." "I was," Dina said. "I have a record from the hospital indicating you were with him through the night. That you stayed." "I did," Dina said. He did not write anything down yet. He looked at her. "Can I ask you why?" he said. Dina was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone who doesn't know the answer, the quiet of someone who is finding the right words for something simple. "He was alone," she said. "People shouldn't be alone when they die if there's somebody who can sit with them." He looked at her for another moment and then looked back at his papers. "He died with an estate valued at approximately $42 million, he said. Dina did not move. He was the founder and majority shareholder of a logistics company that he sold in 2019. He was a private man. He had 2 adult children, Ray and Corinne, who were estranged from him. The estrangement was long and complicated and not relevant to what I need to tell you. He paused. What is relevant is that Mr. Hines revised his will approximately 8 months before his death. He could not have known when he would die or how, but he had written instructions into the revision that were very specific. Dina's hands were still in her lap. He wrote that if he died in a medical setting, he wanted an inquiry made as to whether any medical staff member had stayed with him voluntarily beyond the requirements of their duties. His words were, beyond what they were paid to do. He said that if such a person was found, they were to be located and contacted, and the estate was to provide for them. He found the page he was looking for and turned the portfolio toward her. He left you $450,000, he said. The family consultation room was quiet. The door was closed. Somewhere outside in the hall, someone was pushing a cart, and the wheels made a small, rhythmic sound. And then that sound passed. Dina looked at the figure on the page. She looked at it for a long time. He didn't know me, she said. No, he said. He didn't. He never met me. He was unconscious when I sat with him. That's right. She pressed 2 fingers to the corner of her mouth. Her eyes were bright and her voice was completely level. He wrote that before he even came to this hospital, she said. 8 months before. He'd had a prior hospitalization at another facility, and he'd been alone that time too, and no one had stayed. He told his attorney afterward that it was the worst night of his life. He paused. He didn't want to take the chance again. What he had done was build a provision for a stranger he had not yet met, a person whose kindness he could not know in advance, whose face he would never see. He had put it in his will and signed it, and then he had gone on living with his quiet, private loneliness. And 8 months later, he had ended up in room 318 at Covenant General, and Dana had taken the night shift. The world keeps a ledger of certain things. Not all things. Some things go unrecorded forever, and the people who did them carry those things alone. And that is a kind of loss the world imposes on good people without apology. But some things get written down. Sometimes in a hospital's handoff note by a charge nurse who followed her gut, sometimes in a will by a man who had been alone and remembered it. Dina sat with that for a long moment. Then she said, "What do I need to do?" He walked her through it. The paperwork was straightforward. There would be a meeting with the estate's financial administrator. There was nothing contested. Ray and Corinne Hines had been informed and had not objected. He said this carefully and watched her face. "They sent me a card," Dina said, "after he died. I didn't know how to reach them." He nodded. "They told me. That's actually how I confirmed I had the right person. They remembered the name on the door of his room." Dina looked at the window. There was a parking structure outside, the kind of view that comfort room windows in hospitals usually have, because the rooms were not designed for their views. She looked at the parking structure, and then she looked back at the attorney. "I need to think about whether I'm understanding this correctly," she said. "You are," he said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was something smaller than that, and quieter, more like a breath that had been held for a long time being let go. She had thought about that night sometimes, the way you think about the ordinary things you do in the dark when no one is watching, without knowing if they add up to anything. She had not thought it would add up to this. She had not thought it would add up at all. You sit with someone because you cannot leave them alone, and then you go home and sleep and come back for the next shift, and the ordinary weight of your life settles back on your shoulders, and you carry it because there is nothing else to do. She had not been sitting with him in order to be found later. She had been sitting with him because he was a person. That was the entire reason. Gerald Moss was professional and unhurried. He answered every question she asked, which were careful, practical questions, the kind a woman who had been managing a tight budget for years would ask. She asked about taxes. She asked about timeline. She asked whether there was any condition or obligation attached to the amount, and he said there was not. It was a gift, not a contract. He said that twice. When they were finished, Dina stood up and shook his hand and thanked him. Then she walked back to the 3rd floor and finished her shift. She did not tell anyone that day. She moved through the afternoon the way she moved through every afternoon, checking her patients, documenting, keeping the pace. Her colleague at the desk noticed something in her face and asked if everything was okay, and Dina said yes, she was fine, and went back to her work. She called her mother that evening from the parking lot before she drove home. "Mama," she said when Ruthie answered, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen for a minute before you say anything." Ruthie said, "That's never a good opening, Dana." "It's a good one tonight," Dina said. She told her mother the way she did most things, with the plain facts in order and the weight carried in her voice rather than her words. She told her about the man in room 318 and the night in March 2 years ago, and the attorney and his portfolio, and the amount on the page. She told it all without stopping, and when she finished there was a silence on the line that was longer than Ruthie's usual silences, which were not long. Then Ruthie said, "Baby." "I know," Dina said. "You sat with that man." "I sat with him." Another silence. Dina could hear her mother's breathing. She could picture Ruthie standing in the kitchen on Clement Street with the phone pressed to her ear and her eyes closed, the way Ruthie stood when she was holding something very carefully. "How much?" Ruthie said. Dina told her. Ruthie made a sound that was low and deep and wordless, the kind of sound that comes from somewhere below language, where the feeling is too large to fit through an ordinary word. Dina heard it and pressed her hand flat against the steering wheel and looked through the windshield at the parking lot, at the ordinary nothing of it, and felt something she could not name. "He wrote that before he ever laid eyes on you," Ruthie said. 8 months before, Dina said. "He trusted someone would be there." "He did." Ruthie was quiet for a moment more. Dina heard her take a breath. When she spoke again, her voice was different, lower and steadier, the voice she used when she had reached the bottom of a thing and was standing on it. "Your grandmother used to say that the Lord doesn't balance every ledger in our lifetime," Ruthie said. She said some accounts take longer to settle, and that a person who keeps doing right has to trust that. She paused. "I used to think that was something you say to help people endure, not something that was literally true. And now," Dina said. Ruthie let out a long breath. "And now I'm standing in my kitchen with my hands shaking." Dina stayed in the parking lot for a while after the call. The lot emptied around her as the evening shift settled in and the day shift headed home, and she sat in her car with the engine off and the windows fogging slowly from her breath, and she did not cry right away. She felt something moving toward her that was very large, the way large weather moves across an open plain before you can feel it yet. Slow and inevitable, and already on its way for a long time. She thought about the hours in that room. The monitor's green line and the sounds the building made at 3 in the morning, the city's distant murmur, the particular quality of quiet that hospitals have in the deep middle of the night, when everything that can be done has been done and what remains is only the human weight of presence. She thought about how she had not known his name before that night, had not known anything about him, and how that had not mattered. He was a person. She stayed. She started the car and drove home. In the weeks that followed, Dana moved through the paperwork with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. She hired a financial advisor on the attorney's recommendation, a woman named Patricia who worked out of a small office on the east side and who had a manner that Dana liked immediately, direct and clear and without condescension. Patricia sat with her for 2 hours the first meeting and asked her the right questions, and Dana gave the right answers because she had been living carefully enough for long enough to know exactly what she needed. What she needed was her mother's hip surgery done properly, at a facility with a good orthopedic team and not just the one the insurance would cover without a fight. She needed the car replaced, not with anything lavish, with something reliable that would not keep her up at night calculating which noise was which. She needed her floor raised high enough that a wheel bearing or a missed shift or a month where everything went wrong at once would not bring her within reach of it. She needed options, not luxury. Options. She did not quit her job. This surprised people later when they found out, because people tend to assume that what someone has wanted all along is to stop working. Dina had never wanted that. She had wanted to work without the grinding edge of financial fear at the back of everything, and those two things are not the same. She liked her patients. She liked being good at what she did. She liked walking into a room and knowing what to do and doing it. She was not going to leave that because of money. What changed was the sleeping. She slept better. She woke up in the morning and her first thought was not a number. It was just the morning. Ruthie's surgery was scheduled for a Thursday 6 weeks after Dina signed the estate paperwork. The orthopaedic surgeon had a good reputation and a direct manner, and he told Ruthie what the outcome was likely to be, which was considerably better than the outcome of the previous surgery done at the cheaper facility. Dina sat in the waiting room through the 4-hour procedure and drank bad coffee and read a book she barely retained and waited, the way she had learned to wait from years of watching families in rooms like this one. When the surgeon came out, he said it had gone as expected, and Ruthie would be back to walking without a cane inside of 3 months if she did her physical therapy. Ruthie, he said, was a stubborn and strong woman, and he expected her to do her physical therapy. Dana laughed. "She is both of those things," she said. Ruthie came through it exactly as the surgeon predicted. By the time the forsythia was blooming in the yard on Clement Street, she was walking to the end of the block and back, and she would stop and stand in front of the forsythia and look at it for a minute before she turned around. A woman who had earned the right to stand in the sun and not be in pain. Dina visited on Sundays, as she always had. She still cooked for the week. She did not stop doing that. Some things you do because they need doing, and some things you do because they are how you know who you are. And for Dina, the Sunday cooking was both. One Sunday in June, Dana was at the stove when her mother came and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "That man. Walter." Ruthie moved to the table and sat down, the way she could sit down now without the hip making it a whole production. "I keep thinking about what he must have been like, that he had the presence of mind to put that in his will." Dina stirred the pot. "I think he must have been a lonely man," she said. "I think he knew himself well enough to know it, and that takes something." Ruthie nodded slowly. "And then he ended up in your room." "He ended up in my room," Dina said. They were quiet together in the kitchen, the kind of quiet that families who know each other well can hold without discomfort, with the smell of rice and the sound of the pot and the afternoon light coming through the window above the sink. "Do you think about him?" Ruthie asked. "Sometimes," Dina said. "Not the way you might think. Not sad, exactly. It's more like—" and she paused, turning it over. "It's more like remembering that something happened that mattered, even if you couldn't see it mattering at the time." She had learned this from the work, from the years of sitting beside people in the hardest moments of their lives, and being present without being able to fix the unfixable. You cannot always see the importance of what you're doing when you're doing it. The importance is sometimes something that accumulates over time and then arrives in a form you did not expect. She had known this in the abstract for years. She understood it differently now. There was a man who had been alone and afraid, and he had not had the power to guarantee that someone would sit with him when he died. He had had the power only to make it possible that the right person would be rewarded if they did. He had done that, and then he had let go of the rest, which is all any of us can do with the things that matter most to us. And she had sat with him. Not because she knew, not because she would gain anything, because he was a person, and it was the right thing, and she was someone for whom the right thing was not a calculation. What a person does in the dark when no one is watching is the truest version of who they are. Dana had always known this. She had lived by it without calling it a philosophy, the way most truly good people do. She had not thought anyone was watching when she pulled that chair up beside a dying stranger at 1 a.m. and sat down. Someone was watching, just not the way she would have imagined. That fall, Dina signed a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment on the same side of the city, close enough to her mother that the Sunday drive was still 10 minutes. It was on the 6th floor and the windows faced east, and in the morning the light came in and filled the kitchen in a way she had not expected when she viewed the place but had remembered every day since she moved in. She kept a small table near the east window where she had her coffee in the mornings before work. She did not put anything on the table except the cup and sometimes a book. She kept it spare because the light was enough. Her colleague from the desk came to the housewarming, and so did 2 of the other nurses from the unit, and Ruthie came with her new hip and her old opinions and stood in the kitchen approving of the layout and finding the one thing that was slightly wrong with it, which was that the overhead light was too bright. Dana said she would get a dimmer switch. Ruthie said she better. On the last day of the housewarming, after everyone had gone, Dina stood alone in the kitchen in the quiet of her new apartment. The dishes were done. The table by the east window had a bowl of fruit on it that someone had brought as a gift. She looked at the bowl, and then at the window, and then at the light. She thought about a night that had seemed ordinary when she lived through it. She thought about a man she had never known who had made a decision about the future that she had not known was possible. Because what kind of person does that? What kind of person has enough generosity to plan for a stranger's goodness, to build a door and leave it open for someone whose name he did not know? The kind of person, she thought, who has been alone in the night and knows what it costs. The kind of person who decides, when they have the ability to decide, that the cost should not be borne without acknowledgement. She got her coat from the hook by the door and she pulled it on, and she went down the 6 floors and stood for a moment outside the building in the early October evening air, the city moving around her in its ordinary way. Buses passing, someone's radio in a parked car, the smell of a restaurant 2 doors down, the whole alive, ordinary texture of a world that does not stop to mark the moments that matter. She thought it was enough to sit with him. And then she thought that he had made sure she knew it. That was the whole of it. That was the story. A man who had been afraid of dying alone had written a provision for a stranger's kindness. A woman who could not leave a person alone had sat with him through the night. 2 years later, across the work of a lawyer with a portfolio and a handoff note written by a charge nurse who trusted her gut, the circuit had closed. Some things get written down. Some doors get left open. And sometimes, without any arrangement we can see or plan for, the right person walks through. She went back inside. She took the stairs because the elevator was slow, and she was used to taking the stairs, and some habits are not habits so much as expressions of character that have outlasted the circumstances that formed them. She climbed the 6 flights and went back into her apartment and took off her coat and hung it on the hook, and the bowl of fruit on the table by the east window sat where it had been, and the city ran quietly below, and the night came on in the way that nights do without asking, steady and sure. If you believe, as many people do, that goodness has a way of finding its way back to the people who gave it freely, then what happened to her will feel like confirmation. And if you don't quite believe that, if you've lived through enough to be careful about what you trust, then consider the plain fact of it. A man sat down with a pen and paper and chose to make it true. He made it true by the force of intention and foresight and whatever faith he had left after a long and complicated life. He couldn't know the name of the person he was providing for. He could only open the door and trust that someone worth finding would be on the other side of it, that someone was a nurse who had never left a dying person alone in her career and had not started that night. She did not do it for a reward. She never would have asked. The door was there, and 2 years later, the world sent her through it. Think about the last time you did something good when no one was watching. Hold on to that. If you carry this story with you the way some stories stay, leave a thought in the comments below. And if you're looking for another story about the kind of faith that gets repaid in ways you'd never expect, the next one is waiting for you. This is a work of fiction created for the Black drama storytelling tradition.